Welcome to the SEI podcast series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI podcast series. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I'm a principal investigator in the SEI Software Solutions Division. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Tim Morrow and Matthew Nicolai, and we're going to talk about the Zero Trust journey. Tim is a situational awareness manager in the SEI CERT division, and Matthew is one of our interns working with Tim's team. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So when we get started, we like to know a little bit about the people that we're talking to. And Tim, you've been at the SEI a long while. I'll start with you. Tell us what brought you here and what keeps you here. But Matt, you're an intern. We don't often get a chance to interview interns. So want you to ask, talk a little bit more about how did you get this internship? How did you find out about it? And how exciting is it to be here? So I'm going to start with Tim.
Okay, well, thanks so much. And so I've been here 19 years. I feel very blessed by that. The SEI has been great for me. I've had the opportunity to work in the acquisition area for DoD. I've worked in architecture, software architecture, and now I've moved over into our cybersecurity team. So it's a great place where I've got to combine and put the whole package together now, because cybersecurity is such a big emphasis, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Zero Trust today. So thank you, Susie.
Sure. Matt, how'd you get here?
Well, I'm currently a graduate student studying information security policy and management out here at Carnegie Mellon University. My professional background is in law and federal law enforcement, which kind of touched upon cybersecurity. And last year, I made the executive decision to focus on cybersecurity exclusively. So I made the decision to go to graduate school. And when I was considering different graduate programs, I realized that cybersecurity moves at a breakneck pace. So I want to pick a school that has strong roots in both research and industry, so you can kind of stay on top of things. As a result of that, Carnegie Mellon was my number one choice from day one. And a big reason behind that is because of Carnegie Mellon's historic connection to CERT and the SCI. As we all probably know, CERT is pretty much the birthplace of modern cybersecurity as we know it, and it continues to play a huge role in the industry landscape until this day. So it's been an awesome experience so far. I applied to this internship position at CERT about 6 months ago because I really wanted to take my classroom skills and kind of put them into action. And I ended up joining the CERT division's monitoring response directorate, and I work under Tim Morrow on the situational awareness team. Since joining CERT, I have learned a profound amount about cybersecurity and the current state of the industry. And our work as of now is heavily focused on zero trust architecture, and we try to bridge the gap between government standards and implementation in the real world. So it's been a novel and pretty challenging field that I think makes a positive impact across the board, and I'm really just grateful to be here.
And I think you're an example of that of something that we see a lot in the SEI, somebody who's worked outside you worked in federal law enforcement and got to see some aspects of the real world, but came back for your graduate work and then these kinds of internships. And that pattern is one that we see a lot. We don't see as many people come to the SEI straight out of undergrad school because you kind of need a little bit of real world, involvement to understand why some of the things we do are important. So welcome, and we're glad you're here.
Thank you.
So talking about zero trust, no trust at all. We've done some podcasts on this in the past and why it's important, but I think there are audiences that are new to the topic. So could you just give us a little overview of what are we talking about when we're talking about zero trust? And Tim, we'll start with you, I guess.
Okay, sure. I think zero trust is really interesting right now. It's a moniker or a name that people are really focused on and gravitated to lately. I think it's all about making sure you know who is accessing what on your network in a way that you want them to be. And I think that is not something novel to people, but I think that when you start, as we go through the journey we're going to talk about here, you're going to see there's different aspects about it that people have not thought about in the past. And I know Matt's going to elaborate on that a little bit more. So go ahead, Matt.
Sure. So at the core of the topic, like zero trust architecture, it represents a shift away from the castle and moat style of cybersecurity that's become so prevalent. So in a traditional like castle and moat style network, your perimeter for the network is the moat that pretty much keeps like untrusted bad guys out.
Mm-hmm.
And then when people are inside the castle, they're kind of trusted by default and they can move around and kind of do their thing relatively freely. So, as the name suggests, in Zero Trust, we are trying to remove that element of implicit trust from the castle model. And we want to constantly verify users' identities and privileges, whether they're inside or outside the network. And something that's particularly unique with Zero Trust architecture is that we have a policy decision point that kind of drives all this decision making. And I tried to explain this to my parents in very simple layman's terms, but the best way I can compare it is like a control tower at an airport or perhaps a control tower at a prison where 24/7 you have a system kind of monitoring and granting access as needed. And there's different feed-in points from like external threat intelligence and things like that, similar to radar or CCTV in a real-world tower, that kind of helps to guide decision-making about allowing access.
Okay, so zero trust has lots of technology implications. So when you start talking about continuously verifying, one of the things I've talked to other people about this, and one of the things that makes zero trust even possible is the advances we've had in speed of processors and lots of memory, sort of all of the resources that we have. In the past, you really didn't have a choice to do that continuous monitoring. And so now we have this choice, but there's also this big policy aspect of this. And so, there's, as you said, a policy decision point. How frequently, how often do we look at things? How much of that is, are we seeing people being challenged by zero trust because they're not keeping up with technology? And so they actually can't take advantage. They can't really perform at the speed that zero trust implies? Or is that sort of off the table and everybody's got enough of everything that we don't have to worry about that?
So how about I'll take the first pass at that. So I think it's very challenging when you look at that, because if you mention the logging aspect of things, there's so much information being accumulated and collected from whether it's a SIM tool or trying to get different inputs into a CERT tool to think about and be able to act on activities that are going on. And we're seeing that a lot of times, especially in large organizations, the logging capabilities are stovepiped. And so there's not that integrated view. And that's one key aspect of zero trust that you need to do is have that integrated logging view. I think the other thing is a misconception about being able to, it's all about purchasing a product here. And I think as we talk about this during our podcast today, the zero trust journey is not just about buying a product. There's a lot of things that you need to think about. And it's something that's going to be, you're going to have to keep thinking about for quite a while in the future. So it's an ongoing thing. So I think to me, those are some of the things that I find a little bit challenging. How about Matt? What are some of the ones that we've talked about?
Well, sure. One thing that, as we mentioned, technology has advanced an incredible amount over the last several years, where processors and resources are now much more capable of constantly operating and making decisions. But the flip side of the coin is that networks have become much more complex and their threat surface is exponentially larger. So these kind of go hand in hand in terms of policy considerations and decision making on where to start and how difficult or costly it might be to migrate towards zero trust.
Now, in our federal space, we have federal executive orders that require federal agencies to move in this direction. And that's one of the reasons that we're having this podcast, is because the federal government is trying to figure out how to go about doing this. There's not quite as much pressure on the private sector, other than some sort of leaders that are seeing value in this approach. But I think we want to talk about because this is a relatively young concept, we weren't even talking about this 5 years ago. There's not as much guidance for either federal agencies or large organizations on enterprise implementation and transformation. So tell us a little bit about this journey. And especially, we mentioned, Tim mentioned, you're going to have to buy some products. And so we know there's lots of companies out there saying, buy this. If you use this, you're going to get to zero trust. And those of us that have been in the game a while, anything that sounds too easy usually is too easy, right? It's there's no free lunch. Yeah. So you two published a blog post recently. You outlined 4 steps, basically in a PDCA, a plan, do, check, act kind of cycle for the zero trust journey. So let's talk about those steps and how they can help organizations that are embarking on this journey either because they've been told to or they see value in it. So Matt, let's start with you this time.
Sure, yeah. So in our zero trust journey, we have 4 main steps. The first step in our journey is prepare, which is pretty much an organization trying to set the foundation up for their zero trust transformation. Some common elements of this step would be developing your strategy for migrating to zero trust, identifying your existing infrastructure and resources, working out any budgetary concerns that you might have, as well as creating your roadmap, like over the short and long term, for actually executing that strategy. And once you meet these responsibilities as an organization, you can move on towards the next step, which we refer to as the plan phase. The plan phase is heavily focused on taking inventories, making sure that you're referencing cybersecurity engineering standards and developing your implementation, and as well as monitoring subsequent changes you're going to be making to your enterprise. The inventories that we're going to be doing during this phase should cover your physical, non-physical assets, data flows, as well as any enterprise workflows that you might have within your network. The third part is the...
Can I stop you there? Because what I'm hearing, and from what I've read, prepare and plan together are really, one way to talk about it is understanding what's your risk profile. So, because you're going to have to spend some money to do this. And most people aren't going to spend money unless they see some reason, big benefit or big mitigation of risk. Is that a good read of sort of what those 2 steps are all about?
Yeah, I was going to say, how about I'll pick that one up then. Yeah, that is. I think that's a big part of the prepare pillar we're talking about, is getting that executive endorsement. So doing that, understanding what you have, where you want to go to, that strategy, and developing a roadmap that supports the budget you have. I think that's very key, especially for the commercial side of things. Like you mentioned, Susie, for federal agencies, they have directives and they don't have a choice. But for commercial, it is all about, we think that prepare pillar is to be able to put that package together so you can go talk to your chief technology officer, your CISO, your CEO, and convince them that this is something we need to do, is to make this change. So
okay,
I think,
good.
yeah.
I just wanted, because when we say prepare and plan, it's easy to just think about prepare and plan, right? But the real goal here is to get that executive sponsorship, get everybody to understand. And even in federal agencies, just because I have to do it doesn't mean I have the money to do it. It means, often what it means is I've got to take something else off the table. And understanding, how this risk fits in with my prioritization of my agency's mission is really important if I'm going to actually have people actually do the work that's required for this journey. So, all right, I interrupted you, Matt. Go ahead and tell us about steps 3 and 4, because it's 4 steps.
Yes. The third step, we refer to it as the assess phase. And in the assess phase, we look at your maturity of your zero trust transformation, as well as identifying any gaps that you might have within your architecture. Kind of building on top of the risk discussion that we just had, in the assess phase, you also want to calculate and mitigate any risks that might impact your transformation effort. And finally, you kind of move towards conducting some small-scale inventory pilots, covering both the assets and various flows that would be moving within your zero trust network. And once this phase is complete, then we can move into the final step, which we focus on implementation. In the implement phase, we're focused on developing policies for your zero trust transformation, as well as fostering communication between all kinds of stakeholders within your organization. We also focus on deploying the systems actually and operating them, as you can probably imagine. But on top of that, you want to monitor and measure your network's zero trust behavior to make sure it's functioning properly. And based on what you discover in that element, then you can make changes as they might be necessary.
So I think I'd like to add on to that is a couple of the things that we stress being important in this journey is those inventories. I think when you listen to commercial products talk about zero trust, they typically focus on an aspect like identity and access management or the logging capability or data or the segmenting of your network. And I think the thing that's really important in this process is developing these inventories over time so that you have that very good contextual information concerning who's using what on your network. Basically, you need to have a better understanding so that you can then assess what you want to move to zero trust and then do it through a set of pilots. So that those are things that we try to stress. It's a little bit different than what we typically see in the zero trust documentation.
So you're not promoting a let's go from 0 to 60 right away. You're promoting learn about it. It's an iterative process, right? Learn about it, make iterative changes, and get to a policy that's acceptable and to products that are acceptable for your organization. But realize that through your pilots, you may not have picked the right one the first time. And so you're going to have to, evolve the approach over time. Especially, I think, aren't we in a place right now where the market for the products and processes for this are still kind of in flux? So you're not really in a market where there's a clear, this is the best way for us to implement. And so people, which means we need to be able to have more guidance for people to make selections and understand how their inventories connect to the kinds of products that are available in the marketplace. So we're kind of talking about some differences between federal and industry. Are there some, for our industry listeners, what are some specific issues they're going to have that we might not see in government because government is told you're going to do this, like it or not? And so industry's got some choices, and then sometimes those choices lead us into some different challenges. So why don't you talk about some of those industry-specific challenges you've seen?
Well, I think one is we've touched on it a bit, is just there's less guidance out there. And so I can't go to a bookstore and find a book that tells me how do I implement zero trust, right? And I think they're looking for resources to be able to help them guide what they should be doing, how they should be doing it. I think that's the purpose of our zero trust journey, is to provide that guidance, because I can go look at SANS, or I could go look at Cloud Security Alliance, or all these other different organizations, but there's not going to find a process out there. And I think that's a real issue for commercial companies. And the other thing we touched on too is that executive endorsement and buy-in. I think that is a challenge, because especially now we're seeing that cost inflation and things, can I reuse parts of my existing infrastructure and my network? Is that capability there? I think that's where you have to have that good understanding of what your missions are, what you're trying to do with what people, and figure out, what can I just maybe do this functionality in a reduced way, or way that makes sense for us? Look at the risk associated with that and see, does it make sense for me? Matt, did you have anything you'd like to add in that area?
Sure. One thing I want to add is that, Tim and I discussed yesterday some of the challenges that we kind of see. And one commonality that unfortunately across the board is money. Whether it's a massive government agency with $1 billion budget, or, maybe a smaller energy company, for example, like everyone struggles with money here. And depending on the organization that wants to implement zero trust, it may be easily funded or may be an absolute challenge. And I think that when you kind of venture towards private industry and public-private partnerships, maybe such as energy companies or something, like these budgetary concerns are a little bit more real and a little bit more severe, and there may be more kind of groundwork to make up on their end to get ready for transformation versus the agency. I mean, depends on the agencies. They all have different budgets and levels of preparation, but it might be a little bit more difficult depending on who you're trying to walk through the transformation.
So on the sort of now moving to common aspects and challenges, we've talked about executive level support. I mean, that's one that money and just even the organizational will to do things comes from the executive level. What are some other challenges that, regardless of your government or industry position, you're likely to run into if you're trying to move people towards a zero trust strategy?
So I think one thing is communicating that message to your organization. I think sometimes we get a fear that, we're going to put Big Brother into our system because there's going to be all this monitoring. There's going to be this automated responses to things. And it's not that idea. I think the thing is to be able to, from our point of view, I need to be able to have the forensics information to know if an incident happened, what led up to that, who were the actions. I think I need to be able to think about what are those inputs that go into this, our policy decision point that people need to start thinking about. Because a lot of times a real simple example in this area is if a system administrator is logging in from a different country at 2 in the morning, that's probably not something you want to do. But that's real simple. But I think each organization, they're going to see that they have different instances like that could be is relevant. Maybe it's insider threat considerations, but those are the things that I think every organization, as they think about moving to zero trust, what's applicable to them. And I think that kind of goes back again to having that very good understanding of what your mission are in the context of what your system is.
Yeah.
So
And,
that's
and the
what I do.
context of the world, right? I remember, Tim, you and I don't know if you were here, but I was at the SEI in the time before we had badges. And there was, security was very concerned that it wasn't zero trust, but it was, there's too much trust. Anybody can walk in here at any time, and we do have sensitive information of various types. And there were several years where, there were attempts to sort of get people to adopt badges. The thing that actually was the tipping point was when we had 9/11. And everyone realized badges is not just about keeping the wrong people out. It's about knowing where everybody is. And so, one of the things people said is if the SEI building had been attacked, we wouldn't know who was in the building to know who we had to go rescue, right? And so, a lot of these kinds of mechanisms that are used to add security are also very safety related. And so, understanding, if there is somebody that's in another country at 2 a.m. and they're logging in, that's fine if that's where they are and that's where they need to be. But it's also about understanding that we have people all over the place, and we need to understand how to keep them safe as much as it is about how to keep them secure. And I see zero trust kind of in that light. It's a different way of trying to make sure that we are staying safe within the boundaries, within the ecosystem that we're trying to operate in. Is that a fair characterization?
I would say
Yeah,
so.
no,
You want to go ahead,
yeah,
Tim?
go ahead, Pat. No, I was going to refer it to you because that's why I have you on the team. Is I think this is the policy aspect of things, and I hope you were going to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. As we saw, for example, with the 9/11 example, you had stuff like HSPD 12 coming out and requiring PIV cards and CAC cards, and standardizing it across the federal government and across branches. A big challenge is getting private organizations to kind of pick up on that as well, where they might be lagging behind. They don't have the same level of force pushing them to adopt badging and access standards in that same exact way. Where
Well, and badging is one of the, it's an authentication right? It's an authentication mechanism. With zero trust, we're using different authentication mechanisms that involve a lot of automation and that actually are less intrusive in some ways than some of these external physical kinds of security controls, like the badging. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so. And then something else is like, post 9/11, you had intelligence sharing became much more of a thing across various federal agencies, so they can, make better decisions.
Right.
And the same thing kind of needs to happen here, where your policy decision point, it needs all kinds of intelligence feeds to kind of come into it. And the more you can provide to it, the better decisions it can make regarding, network security, as well as enterprise decision making that might result from network security.
And this is another area. So this area is one that is ripe for machine learning and AI techniques. When you talk about, essentially data fusion of all these different sources. But I also like to point out that anytime we talk about machine learning, it's machine learning to enable human decision making. We're not talking about automating the decision process to the point where we eliminate the human factor in decision making, because that's ultimately, what we have to we have decisions that are going to enable or disable people from interacting with our systems, and those need to be made by humans that understand our ecosystem, not just by the machines that are giving us a recommendation. And so, are you connecting yet with the ML community in terms of some of the ways that machine learning can sort of help the zero trust journey? Is that an area of research I have to look forward to from you?
Yeah, we're working on that. That's for sure. So, I think what we're trying to do is get that environment understood, because I think that's the thing that's going to be challenging for us. Is you're exactly right that all this has to do with AI and ML, and doing that dynamic policy decision point is going to offer a lot of opportunities to people. And I know our own AI division, we're looking forward to providing that content to let them think about how to do some of these things better. I think another thing that we're hoping to do real soon is have a zero trust industry day where we kind of pose questions out there for people. We're going to develop a scenario, and we want people to come back with some ideas of, well, how would they do zero trust, and have some areas where they think about they want to do some research. So we're looking to try to build this. So right now we're just kind of getting the word out, focusing on the implementation side of things, or how to implement and what you need to think about. But that's the next big step for us, I think.
Okay. Well, that means that I'll get to have another podcast opportunity with you. So I'll
I'm
look forward
looking
to that.
forward. Yeah, me too. It's always a blast.
But so research, we've talked about sort of, we've got this process that is ready to be used within industry and government to help people. We've got some research ideas for the future. Talk for a few minutes about transitions, because that's the real meat of our work, is how do we make sure that these good ideas are usable within both industry and government? What are some of the resources? You just mentioned an industry day that is going to be coming up. But what are some other things that people can look at to help them if they decide they want to embark on this journey that we can provide?
Right. Well, I'll start and then I'll let Matt add on to that. So one thing we not touched on, and it's my mistake here, is across this transition, we think it's very important to do assessments, because it's about maturity. We see all these different, I've seen at least 4 different zero trust maturity models. And it's like, that's fine. People tell you the levels, but how do you make that assessment? So when we talk about a zero trust journey, we talk about how to be able to provide the right artifacts to be able to make that assessment. And I think that's something that we need to stress here, is to think about, as you do these things, you need to have that information to provide that evidence to show that you're doing things. So to me, that's one thing moving forward, is putting the information out there of what should be in an assessment. How do you perform that assessment? We have public documents out now that talk about the different assessment methods that we recommend, and we're going to be developing new ones that are more tailored to zero trust. So that's it. And
Okay.
go ahead.
So
Matt,
is it fair to say that right now the assessment in industry, I don't know if it's an industry, but assessment has zero trust as an element of typical security assessments, but a zero trust centric assessment is not really globally available yet. Is that a fair statement?
That's right. So, like in the federal space, they have the high value asset assessment is one that I know we work on and do, and people have an idea on that. But yeah, I've not found, maybe you have, Matt, that I don't think we have anybody that says, well, I can assess you to be at a certain level. It's not like the CMMC or CMMI like that was at this point yet.
Matt, do you want to add anything?
Sure, absolutely. As Tim kind of mentioned, this is a very novel space, and there's a lot of work to be done over. It's going to take years, especially depending on the size of the enterprise. This is not an overnight process by any stretch of the imagination, and it's sort of like the Wild West still, where there's some government standards coming out. Like there's stuff from NIST, for example, like 800-207, that can be referenced by organizations. As a standard, as well as in the academic community, if you're doing research, you can kind of build off of that, grab certain elements of it and really focus on it. And hopefully that kind of translates into a product offering that can kind of make everyone's life easier. But on top of things like that, you do have, like, for example, like CISA has their zero trust maturity model where, again, it's not this perfect rubric for assessing every single organization. There's still significant amounts of leeway and internal decision making that kind of has to go into seeing where an organization stands. So, but we are going to see, I think, a lot more emphasis within this field over next coming years, and it's going to require government action, private sector efforts, and collaboration with academia to kind of make it all happen smoothly and quickly.
Smoothly and quickly are good goals. Having worked in some other maturity model arenas, I know that smoothly and quickly are good aspirations. I'll put it that way. But you guys are working on things that are foundational to that. I mean, and that's, I think, what I'm appreciating is you're looking beyond the maturity model construct of what does it take for us to actually improve an organization's position in terms of this kind of strategy. And at the end of the day, that's the action you need. It doesn't matter, what your number is or what your risk factors are. It's what are you doing about it? And giving us this kind of guidance. I thank you both. And I know you've got other members on your team that work this too, for taking that, because the implementation step is never easy on any of these things. We've got all these grand ideas, and when the rubber meets the road is when you really find out where all the challenges are that are going to make it not as smooth and not as fast. So I want to thank both of you for talking with us today. As I said, as we've said throughout the podcast, there are many resources for this, and we will include links to the ones we've talked about, as well as some others in the transcript that we build for the podcast. I want to remind our audience that our podcasts are available almost everywhere: SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and of course, my favorite, the SEI YouTube channel. And so if you like what you hear and see today, feel free to give us a thumbs up, just like you do all the other videos that you like. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And thank you, Matt, especially for coming in and being an intern with us. I know it's challenging to disrupt your life when you're in grad school with this job kind of thing and everything, but we do appreciate your work. And of course, Tim, always a pleasure. So look forward to the next time we get to talk.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.